Have you ever really thought about why we treat a dog like part of the family, but a pig? Well, a pig becomes bacon. It's a weird inconsistency, right? Well, philosopher Peter Singer took that exact question and built one of the most challenging ethical arguments of our time. So let's dive into his case against what he calls speciesism.
Singer's whole argument really forces us to look this question right in the eye. On the surface, it seems kind of simple, but the answer, wow, the answer could completely flip our entire relationship with the animal kingdom on its head.
So, where does Singer even begin? He kicks things off with a concept he argues is a deep-seated prejudice, one that's just as morally wrong as racism or sexism. He gives it a name: speciesism.
So what is speciesism? Well, think of it as an automatic bias. It's the idea that we give special treatment to the interests of humans simply because they're human, while totally dismissing those same interests when they belong to another animal.
And this is where his argument really gets its punch. He draws a direct line. Just like racism arbitrarily says one race is superior and sexism says one gender is superior, speciesism arbitrarily says one species, ours, is superior to all others. I mean, that is a bold, provocative thing to say.
Now, for that argument to even stand up, Singer has to first get us to rethink what equality actually means. Because let's be real, humans and animals are obviously not the same in every way. So how on earth could they be equal?
And this right here is a super important distinction. Singer says equality can't be about facts. Even among humans, we aren't factually equal. We've all got different talents, different levels of strength, you name it. Instead, he says, equality has to be a moral idea. It's not about how we are, but about how we ought to be treated.
This leads him to his central idea, the principle of equal consideration of interests. See, it's not about treating everyone the exact same. It's about giving the same weight to their similar interests. So, for example, a woman's interest in avoiding pain matters just as much as a man's. It gets equal consideration.
And here's the big move. He takes that logic and just extends it right across the species barrier. If the main interest is avoiding suffering, then the incredible suffering of a pig in a factory farm has to be given the same moral weight as the similar suffering of a human. The species doesn't matter. The interest in not suffering does.
So this brings us to the absolute core of the argument. If we're going to consider interests equally, we have to figure out which beings even have interests to begin with. Where do we draw that line?
What's the one quality that actually gives a being moral standing in the first place? What's the thing that really counts?
Is it the ability to do calculus or write philosophy books? Singer says, nope, that's not it.
Okay, how about language? Is that the special ticket into the moral club? Again, he argues, absolutely not.
Instead, Singer reaches back to the 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who just cut through all the noise with this killer question. He said the question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And honestly, that's the whole game right there.
And that leads to a pretty straightforward conclusion. If a being can feel pain and pleasure, if it's sentient, then it has a basic interest in not being in pain. And to just ignore that interest, in Singer's view, is nothing more than prejudice.
Of course, this is a pretty wild idea, and it definitely brings up some big questions and objections. So let's take a look at how Singer tackles the most common ones.
This is probably the number one objection: our intelligence. Surely, our big brains give us a special status, right? But Singer has a really powerful counter for this.
He uses what's called the argument from marginal cases, and it really highlights a huge contradiction in how we think. Look, if we say high intelligence is what grants you moral value, what do we do about human infants or adults with severe cognitive disabilities? A healthy chimpanzee is smarter and more self-aware than a human newborn. So for being consistent, we'd have to say it's more acceptable to experiment on the infant than the chimp. And since almost nobody would ever agree to that, it proves intelligence can't be our real moral standard. The only thing left is a simple bias for our own species.
Okay, this is the other big one you always hear. People worry this leads to ridiculous conclusions, like campaigning for pigs to get the right to vote. But this is just a total misunderstanding of the argument.
It all comes back to that key difference between equal consideration and equal treatment. A pig has no interest in voting, so giving it that right is meaningless. But a pig does have a profound interest in not being tortured, an interest we share. It's about respecting the actual interests a being has, not giving them rights they can't even use. So
if we actually accept this whole line of reasoning, that sentience is the key, and that we have to give equal consideration to similar interests, what does that actually mean for our day-to-day lives?
What it reveals is this fundamental problem in our current system. We take a major interest of an animal, its interest in avoiding a life of agony, and we sacrifice it for a completely trivial interest of our own, like a preference for how a certain food tastes.
And for Singer, the conclusions that follow are pretty stark. Things like industrial factory farming, which causes unbelievable suffering to billions of animals just for pleasure, becomes a massive moral wrong. And most animal testing, where we inflict horrible pain for often uncertain results, becomes ethically impossible to defend.
So in the end, this isn't just some abstract philosophical game. If we actually take this principle of equal consideration seriously, it demands a massive, radical change in our society and in our own personal choices.
And that leaves us with this final, unavoidable question. It's not really about whether you agree with every single point Singer makes. It's about confronting the logic. If the capacity to suffer is what truly matters, what are we, as people and as a society, going to do about it? What needs to change?